have to do is to go out into the open market and obtain the stock at the current market price. And what is it at this time? It's $172. So we're going to have to pay $17,200 to go out and get the stock in the open market. And then what do we have to do? Well, under the terms of the contract, we have to turn right around and sell it to the call owner for $160 per share, because that, of course, is the strike price that we agreed to. The sale will produce cash received in the account of $16,000. So in that situation overall, the investor has paid $17,200 and received only $16,600, so that produces a loss of $600. So when we're doing these transactions that involve some type of an assignment or exercise, we need to remember that one of those transactions is going to occur at the strike price of the option, because the exercise, of course, is based on the strike price that we originally agreed to when we set up the contract. Now, there is a third possible outcome. We've looked at option expiration and option exercises. This third possible outcome is that option that could be liquidated or closed out. And we've not really talked about this before, so we should look at the concept. Now, to explain this concept, what we'll do is to look at a group of investors, all of whom have been involved as buyers or sellers with the same option. They've either all sold or bought a specific option contract. Now, in this case, it's going to be the XYZ January 50 call option. Now, each investor here has set up a relationship with the other investor. For example, buyer number 1 and seller number 1 at one time engaged in an option transaction, and the premium changed hands between those two. Buyer number 2 and seller number 2 also did the same thing. They exchanged money in an agreement prior to that. So this buyer paid this seller a premium. But notice, though, that the contract is the same. Buyer 3 paid seller 3 a premium, again, to buy this specific contract. But notice, though, that even though we have different transactions done at different times between various buyers and sellers, all of the buyers are really in the same position. They all have the right to buy 100 XYZ at $50 per share until the January expiration. And likewise, all the sellers are in the same boat. They have the obligation to sell XYZ at $50 per share. So in many ways, all the sellers are interchangeable and all of the buyers are interchangeable. So this is going to be a very useful feature to us as we go through this particular problem. Now, what we want to do here is to put ourselves in the shoes of one of these sellers. Now, remember that the sellers have agreed to sell the stock at $50 per share. Now, if you sell a call option, what are you worried about? Well, we're worried about the stock going up in value. So what if the seller, for example, takes a look at the open market and sees the market value of this XYZ stock rising to, say, like $58 a share? Now, they're going to get a little concerned because they did receive a premium up front. And although they know what that is, they also know what they could receive an exercise notice at any time. That would require them, assuming they're uncovered, to buy the stock at 58 and turn right around and sell it at 50. But remember that if you're a seller of an option, you don't control when the exercise occurs. The writers don't control the exercise. It's the owners of the option that control it. And what could happen? Well, you might not get an exercise notice right now. In fact, things could get even worse. For example, what if the market value continued to rise? Let's say it went up to $65 per share, for example. Now, again, you're sitting here with this obligation to sell the stock at 50, and the stock is already up to 65. So anytime you could get a notice saying, you have to give me stock at 50, so you'd have to go out and buy the stock at 65. You have an even bigger loss staring you in the face. So notice that if the stock keeps going up, the sellers ought to be awfully uncomfortable. Their losses keep mounting up, and at least on paper. And there is no way that they can say, well, let's just go through with the exercise and get this over with, and at least I know what my loss would be at that time. They don't have that kind of control. They don't decide when the exercise occurs. Now, there is something else that the writer could do in this situation to try to get out of the dilemma of just having your losses mounting up and mounting up. Remember that we're dealing with a contract here, and there is a buyer and seller, or writer, involved in each of the contracts. And with any contract situation, of course, both parties are bound by the contract unless one party can get the other party to release them from the contract. So it would certainly be nice if seller 1 could get buyer 1 to let him or her out of the contract. But notice that if we can't get buyer 1 to do that, seller 1 could get any of these buyers to release him or her from the contract. If we were able to do that, our obligation would cease at that point. So let's say that seller 1 can get buyer 2 to release them from that particular contract. If buyer 2 would be willing to do that, seller 1's obligation would be canceled out along with buyer 2's right. And both of those players would in effect leave the game. Now notice that we still have 2 buyers and 2 writers, 2 sellers left in the game at this point. Now remember, we always have to have equal numbers of those parties. Now, why would a buyer allow you to do this? To say, I'll let you out of the game and I'll cancel your obligation, and along with that, my right disappears at the same time. Why would a buyer do that? Of course, there has to be some incentive, and we can imagine that incentive is a payment, a fee, a premium. That's why the buyer would do it for you. The seller pays the buyer a premium to allow the contract to be canceled at that point. Now, we'll see that it may cost you a bit of money to get your obligation canceled at this point, but it may be worthwhile for you to do that. At least you know what your losses are at that particular point, and you're not waiting for the stock to go even higher and cause even greater losses for you. So, to do that occasionally, sellers want their obligation canceled. They pay a fee to the buyer or the owner of the option to release them from the contract, and the obligations are then canceled. So that's known as liquidating or closing out an option position. And notice in that situation that if a writer wants out, a buyer has to leave the game as well, so that we always have equal numbers of buyers and sellers left in the game at this particular time. So these pairs of transactions that these options investors engage in would be called opening and closing transactions. So it's important to know how this vocabulary works. For example, an investor who starts by buying an option would be engaging in an opening purchase, which is kind of like an opening move in a game. To liquidate this position, an investor would do a closing sale. So notice that you do the opposite. If I open by buying, I close by selling. Investors who write options, what are they doing? Well, they're doing opening sales. Their opening move is to sell or write an option. So how do they leave the game and cancel their obligation? They would do a closing purchase that cancels out their original sale. Now in our example, we assume that we found an investor out there who was a buyer already, who owned that option, who would allow us to cancel our contract. So 1 writer and 1 owner left the game at the same point. But what if none of those buyers were willing to let you out of the contract? Remember that these buyers are in a good position now. The stock is going up and their call options are worth a lot of money, so they may not want to let you out of the contract. Well, there is another way for you to get out of the game in this situation. If you could find somebody to act as a substitute for you in the game, think of it that way. So for example, let's see if we can find another investor to take our place in this situation. Seller 1, for example, might find a substitute seller 4 who is willing to take his or her place in the game. Seller 1 and seller 4 would have to reach an agreement on fair compensation. This would take the form of a premium paid